Today, we explore the life of one of the most controversial figures of the American frontier, Louis Wetzel. Renowned for his unmatched skill in wilderness survival and a rifle that seemed perpetually loaded, Wetzel was both a folk hero to his contemporaries and, by modern moral standards, a relentless killer. His exploits against Native Americans earned him deep respect among settlers, but provoke revulsion in the present day. A symbol of the unforgiving frontier ethos, Wetzel's story is steeped in the brutality and contradictions of early American expansion. Born in 1763, the same year that King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763 to curb colonial settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains in an effort to protect native lands, Wetzel grew up in an era when many settlers saw such restrictions as mere obstacles rather than law. Despite British attempts to restrain westward expansion, land-hungry colonists regarded territories such as present-day Ohio and West Virginia as opportunities for new beginnings. However, these lands were neither vacant nor unclaimed. They were home to various indigenous nations, including the Shawnee, who fiercely resisted encroachment. Wetzel's family was among the many who ignored the royal proclamation, settling in 1770 in what is now Wheeling, West Virginia, on the eastern banks of the Ohio River. The river soon became both a literal and symbolic boundary. American settlers established dominance to the east, while native tribes, such as the Shawnee, fought to defend the lands to the west. Life on this contested frontier was marked by simmering tensions that erupted into open conflict with the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775. As the war ignited, most Native American tribes, recognizing the threat posed by unchecked colonial expansion, aligned with the British, who at least nominally upheld native land claims. For settlers in Wheeling, this alliance resulted in a surge of violent raids, further deepening the already bitter hostilities of the region. However, Wheeling was no passive victim in this conflict. Settlers launched their own brutal attacks, including the notorious 1777 killing of Shawnee leader Cornstalk, a respected warrior and diplomat who had initially sought peace. His murder only intensified the cycle of vengeance that would shape Wetzel's worldview. By 1778, as frontier violence escalated, a young Louis Wetzel found himself thrust into the brutal realities of frontier life. Around the age of 14, while working on his family's farm alongside his younger brother, he encountered a group of native warriors emerging from the woods. Instinctively, Wetzel reached for his father's rifle, an act of foresight that proved crucial as raids in the region had become increasingly frequent. A warrior's musket ball grazed his chest, wounding but not incapacitating him. Despite his injury, Wetzel and his brother were taken captive and ferried across the Ohio River. For 2 harrowing nights, the brothers remained uncertain of their fate, whether they would be executed, tortured, or perhaps even adopted into the tribe, a common yet terrifying possibility for captives of the era. On the second night, they orchestrated a daring escape, slipping their bonds while their captors slept, demonstrating an audacity that would define his legend. Wetzel not only led their escape, but also crept back into the camp to retrieve his father's rifle and a pair of moccasins before disappearing into the night. Their unexpected return stunned their settlement, as most had assumed them lost forever. This experience solidified Wetzel's unrelenting hatred for Native Americans, a hatred that would soon turn lethal. By the age of 15, Wetzel had already begun seeking vengeance. One day, when a group of frontiersmen sought his help in retrieving horses allegedly stolen by a native raiding party, Wetzel eagerly joined the pursuit. In the ensuing encounter, he found himself isolated, outnumbered, and facing 2 native warriors. Employing a tactic that foreshadowed his deadly cunning, he used a stick to hold his hat beyond a tree's cover, tricking his adversaries into firing prematurely. As they revealed their positions, Wetzel struck with ruthless efficiency, killing both men and scalping them, an act that, while gruesome, was widely accepted among frontiersmen and at times even incentivized by colonial authorities. One such bounty came in the form of a $100 reward for slain warrior, The Wetzel reportedly gave the sum to a young woman he admired, intending for her to use it to furnish a home. Yet this gesture did nothing to temper his growing obsession with cementing his reputation as an Indian killer. By the age of 17, he had joined local militias as a scout, a role that required him to track native movements, ambush them when possible, and serve as an unflinching defender of frontier settlements. Unlike formal soldiers, scouts received no official pay or provisions, relying entirely on their own weapons and survival skills. Lewis Wetzel's legacy remains one of deep controversy. A product of his time, embodied both the relentless grit of the frontier and the merciless violence that came with it. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was nothing more than a ruthless executioner. His story, woven into the fabric of the volatile Ohio River Valley, serves as a grim testament to the savagery of early American expansion and the blood-soaked myths that shaped its history. For Lewis Wetzel, the frontier was not just a battleground, it was his calling. He quickly gained notoriety as a ruthless and unrelenting figure, a man who embodied the violent chaos of the borderlands. His reputation was matched by an imposing presence. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with a muscular build, Wetzel was a striking figure, but it was his long, dark hair that set him apart. He never cut it, allowing it to grow nearly to his calves when unbound. This was no mere affectation. It was a deliberate challenge, a symbol of both defiance and fatalism. Wetzel believed he would one day fall in battle to a native warrior, and the length of his hair would serve as the ultimate prize for his enemies. It was a mixture of vanity, superstition, and provocation, a physical testament to his prowess and an unspoken dare to those who would seek his scalp. Yet his physical presence was only part of what made Wetzel a legend. He possessed a rare and deadly skill, the ability to reload his rifle while running. In an era when muzzle-loading firearms required careful, time-consuming steps to prepare a second shot, Wetzel's ability to reload on the move was nothing short of extraordinary. This mastery of his weapon became his signature, elevating him beyond the ranks of ordinary frontiersmen and ensuring his place in frontier lore. His skill likely saved his life during a disastrous 1782 expedition led by Colonel William Crawford into the Ohio Territory. The campaign, intended to destroy native villages as a show of force, ended in catastrophe. Crawford was captured and brutally executed, along with many of his men, in retribution for prior settler massacres. Wetzel, however, managed to escape. On his journey back, he traveled with a companion, John Mills, but they were soon ambushed. Mills was shot and killed, leaving Wetzel to face a small band of warriors alone. Outnumbered and relentlessly pursued, he sprinted through the dense forest, pausing only to fire at his attackers. He managed to kill one, then reloaded his rifle mid-stride, an almost impossible feat. His pursuers, stunned by his seemingly endless supply of ammunition, hesitated in disbelief, calling out in astonishment. Thus, the phrase, "his gun always loaded," became part of the legend that followed Wetzel in frontier ballads and fireside tales. A life fueled by hatred and revenge for Wetzel, life as a scout and Indian hunter was not just a duty, it became an obsession. His hatred for Native Americans was deeply personal, and with each new family tragedy, it only grew more intense. In 1786, he witnessed his father, John, and his brother, George, being murdered in an ambush on the Ohio River. That same year, his sister Christina was killed in another raid. These events pushed Wetzel beyond even the brutal norms of frontier warfare. No longer content with retaliatory strikes, he began killing indiscriminately, targeting any native person he encountered. One particularly infamous incident saw him infiltrate a native camp under cover of darkness, where he murdered 2 sleeping men. He later expressed disappointment that he had missed a third target. In another case, he and his companion, Jonathan Zane, tracked down and slaughtered 5 native warriors, collecting their scalps. As trophies, Wetzel's methods were not lost on his contemporaries. While many frontiersmen had their own grievances against native groups, few pursued vengeance with such relentless cruelty. Simon Kenton, another famed frontiersman, reportedly expressed deep regret after killing a subdued Shawnee warrior, describing it as an unnecessary act of violence. Wetzel, by contrast, never wavered in his convictions. He saw Native Americans not as individuals, but as a permanent enemy, one to be exterminated without hesitation. Between 1779 and 1788, historian James P. Pierce estimated that Wetzel killed at least 27 Native Americans, though some accounts place the number far higher, possibly exceeding 100. His rifle stock bore more than 20 notches, each supposedly marking a life he had taken. Despite his growing notoriety, he faced little consequence, at least for a time. Defiance against authority in 1788, Wetzel's actions finally drew the attention of military leaders at Fort Harmar in Marietta, Ohio. General Josiah Harmar, tasked with overseeing peace negotiations with the Seneca chief Tecumseh, issued strict orders that Wetzel was not to interfere. Wetzel, however, had no interest in diplomacy. Ignoring Harmar's command, he ambushed Tecumseh along the road, shooting and scalping him. Though the chief survived long enough to identify Wetzel as his assailant, Wetzel remained defiant and unapologetic. He had no use for peace, only revenge. The attack outraged military officials. Harmar ordered Wetzel's arrest, one of the few instances where he faced any legal repercussions for his actions. However, Wetzel's supporters, settlers who viewed him as a hero, rallied in his defense. To them, his actions were not criminal but justified, a necessary response to the violence they had endured. When he was imprisoned, his allies stormed the jail and freed him, ensuring that any notion of justice against him was erased. Afterward, he disappeared for a time, evading further consequences. In the eyes of the law, he was virtually untouchable. Yet the incident revealed a growing divide. While many settlers revered him as a fearless protector, others began to question the unchecked brutality that had become his legacy. As stories of his exploits spread, Wetzel's reputation took on an almost mythical quality. He was immortalized in ballads, folklore, and even art, a frontier icon whose legend overshadowed the harsh realities of his life. The complexity of a legacy, the story of Louis Wetzel, offers a stark window into the brutal and morally ambiguous world of the early American frontier. To understand Wetzel is to understand the endless cycles of violence that defined this period. Cycles of raids, revenge killings, and a deep-seated hatred that left little room for peace. Wetzel's unyielding thirst for vengeance mirrored the fears and survival instincts of many settlers who lived under the constant threat of attack. To them, his actions were not acts of savagery, but of necessity. He became a symbol of frontier resilience, a man who refused to yield in an era where mercy was often mistaken for weakness. Yet his legacy is far darker than that of men like Daniel Boone or Simon Kenton. While Boone and Kenton balanced their frontier exploits with moments of diplomacy and respect for native cultures, Wetzel embodied the most ruthless aspects of expansion. He was not a man of exploration or adventure. He was a man consumed by hatred. Historians often point to Wetzel's life as a tragic reflection of the colonial frontier, a world where violence begot more violence, leaving no room for reconciliation. For the Shawnee, Delaware, and other indigenous nations of the Ohio Valley, Wetzel was a symbol of settler aggression and the broader campaign of displacement that would ultimately destroy their way of life. To them, his killings were not acts of heroism, but of indiscriminate slaughter, part of a relentless wave of land theft and bloodshed that reshaped the continent. Wetzel's legend endures, but it is inseparable from the moral complexities of his time. His story is not one of triumph, but of a relentless, self-perpetuating cycle of violence, one that left scars on both sides of the frontier. The waning years are a relic of violence as Wetzel aged. His reputation remained formidable, though the fervor and purpose that once defined his life began to fade. The frontier, once a lawless expanse where survival demanded brutality, was slowly becoming more structured as settlements expanded and towns took root. By the early 1790s, federal policies sought to establish formalized relations with native nations, and state leaders increasingly attempted to curb the cycles of violence that had shaped the borderlands for decades. Wetzel, a man forged in an era of unrestrained bloodshed, found himself increasingly out of place. Unable or unwilling to adapt to the new order, he became a relic of a fading time, a warrior with no more battles to fight. His need for vengeance had been sated, yet he struggled to find a purpose beyond it. By 1791, Wetzel had drifted westward, searching for new opportunities or perhaps an escape from the world that had begun to move past his brand of warfare. He attempted to integrate into the growing frontier society in Spanish-controlled Louisiana and even joined military campaigns against the Spanish in the region. Yet his reputation, once an asset in the wilds of the Ohio frontier, now followed him like a shadow. The ruthless fighter who had once struck fear into his enemies found little fulfillment in his new ventures. The world was changing, and Wetzel, once a figure of unstoppable force, was now a man out of time. Final years and death as his life slowed. So too did his mind and body. His later years were marked by a decline in both physical strength and, some accounts suggest, mental stability. Whether haunted by the weight of the countless lives he had taken or simply struggling to find a place in a world that no longer needed him, Wetzel's restless nature gave way to an aimless existence. In the 1790s, he continued moving westward, venturing into the Spanish-held Louisiana Territory, a land still caught in colonial rivalries and conflicts. Perhaps he hoped to escape his past, or at least the settlers who had begun to view his relentless bloodshed with growing discomfort. But even as he crossed borders, his legend clung to him. His name, once celebrated, had become a controversial specter of a more savage time. He briefly served the militia forces in Spanish Louisiana, but he never recaptured the sense of purpose he had once known. By 1808, Wetzel's health had deteriorated significantly. Weak and alone, far from the settlements that had once revered him, he died at the age of 45 in Natchez, Mississippi. There was no fanfare, no recognition, no glory, only the quiet passing of a man who had once been a terror on the frontier. His burial was an unremarkable affair, his grave left unmarked, as if history itself sought to obscure or soften the impact of his legacy. The controversial legacy of Louis Wetzel today, Wetzel remains a polarizing figure. To some, he is still remembered as a fearless protector of settlers, a man who embodied the rugged individualism and relentless resilience of early America. His exploits were celebrated in frontier ballads, folklore, and even early novels, where he was often portrayed as a valiant defender against hostile attacks. Generations of settlers sang of the Indian fighter's daring feats, immortalizing him in a tradition that placed him alongside figures like Paul Bunyan or Davy Crockett, though his story was far darker in tone. Yet modern historians take a more critical view. They see Wetzel as a tragic figure, a man consumed by vengeance and unable, or unwilling, to imagine a world in which coexistence was possible. His single-minded pursuit of native destruction overshadowed any chance for reconciliation, leaving him isolated as the world moved on. His life serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating the destructive power of hatred and the human cost of a life devoted to violence. Wetzel's actions reflect the harsh reality of the American frontier, where violence was frequent, brutal, and often indiscriminate. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's past. The settlers, who lived in constant fear and hardship, were drawn into cycles of retribution that left deep scars on both sides. Figures like Wetzel became the embodiment of this hostility, serving as reminders of the sacrifices made and the moral price paid for westward expansion. While some still view him as a symbol of frontier courage, others see him as an unsettling reflection of the darkest aspects of that history. Louis Wetzel in perspective. Ultimately, the life of Louis Wetzel defies simple classification. He was a product of his time, shaped by a world where violence was not just a reality, but a necessity for survival. His actions, though often indefensible, speak to the era's harsh realities, when fear and hatred dictated the terms of existence, and survival often meant embracing brutality. Wetzel's legacy is one of contradiction. He was both a hero and a villain, both an icon of frontier resilience and a manifestation of its most savage instincts. His story is a stark reminder of the moral complexities of early American expansion, a time when hope, fear, and vengeance collided in a landscape that showed little mercy. In the end, Wetzel's life warns of the dangers of unchecked hatred and the cycles of violence that can consume a person, a community, and even a nation. His name endures not just as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of the heavy costs of conquest, survival, and the human toll of a history forged in blood.